Native Japanese people of Reddit, what do you think about Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombing? Posting on behalf of a Japanese grandpa I know who was born and raised in Tokyo. We're both into history, so we've talked about it a lot. He views the bombings as terrible, but doesn't fully blame or hate the US for them. Instead, he blames the emperor for not listening to military advisors like Isoroku Yamamoto, who basically warned Japan that the war they were getting into was unwinnable. He maintains that Japanese wartime rations and famine and firebombing were just as horrific and happened for years, but the West doesn't talk about those as much. He acknowledges that he's more liberal than his countrymen in this regard, possibly because he was raised by a scholarly father-mother, his words. He was also an international salesman salaryman in the 80s, so having that world exposure opened up some of his views, he said. He's also genuinely curious about what the American home front was like, so I've swapped stories between my own 94-year-old grandmother and him. And I try to bring him English books about the era when I visit, as Japanese publishers don't cover the topic. To those unaware, Isoroku Yamamoto didn't develop these feelings late in the war, he acknowledged it almost immediately after Pearl Harbor. I read a biography of him and it stated in no uncertain terms he was stridently against starting hostilities against the United States before Pearl Harbor because of his significant time spent in the United States made him consider it a strategically terrible move based on his understanding of the U.S. industrial base, competence of the population, and sheer vastness of the territory. There was a very typical split between the opinion of the Imperial Navy and the Army, where he opposed virtually every substantial land invasion, which is arguably just part of a Navy bias, as the Japanese Army did better than he argued they would in China. I'd have to imagine being wrong before would have decreased his political capital substantially against the many military advisors who advocated a strike against the US because the US was choking off Japanese imports vital for their wars. To touch on your part about the vastness of the US. There's been a lot of discussion about this and how it would be almost impossible to ever invade the US, even before modern-day technology and our big gun culture. The fact we are good allies with Canada and on decent terms with Mexico makes it hard for anyone who would attempt it. Logistically, trying to move an entire army towards us would mean certain doom for the majority of soldiers before they even reached us. If it were China or Russia, the best option would be through Alaska and then down Canada to Washington. Not only would this be geographically difficult, but it would mean waging war with Canada just to get a presence in the US. Add in our modern-day advancements and the fact that we could easily arm our entire population based on the amount of privately owned guns we have, and it would be a fool's errand. Instigating strife through social media is proving more effective than any land army. Indeed it has. I said this in another comment, but it seems that there is a war waging on our social structure to destroy us from within. Native Japanese in my 20s. The bombings are in our collective mind, the representation of the atrocity of war. Therese, definitely a strong victim mentality, and the general public do not imagine ourselves to be the aggressors of history. We are completely oblivious to the other st we have committed, since the education system is structured in a way that let us sweep the past under the rug. We were graced by the USS intervention that enabled us to erase any acknowledgement of our pasts and spent the last 75 years rebuilding our national identity around being meticulous hard workers. Our society is devoted to turning everyone into company robots, malleable with zero backbone. Voter turnout for people in their 20s is about 30%. We don't think about politics and our knowledge of history is limited. So in short, bomb bad war, and that's about it. So they never told you about what happened in Manchuria or Unit 731. Edit, warning: if you don't want to read some really disgusting stuff, don't look up Unit 731. Unit 731, that is one of those atrocities I wish I could unlearn. When Joseph Mengele is taking notes, you know you've reached the bottom of humanity's barrel. Mengele wasn't the only one taking notes. From Wikipedia, the researchers in Unit 731 were secretly given immunity by the United States in exchange for the data they gathered through human experimentation. Y'all really bashing up for an honest question? There's nothing wrong with trying to gain insight to a tragedy from another person's culture's point of view. Would y'all be mad if an honest person from the Middle East asked us about our experience with 9/11? I wouldn't be mad at all. On the other hand, I'm always mad about everything, all the time. Duck you, fuck me, fuck everything, fuck the world. Every ducking answer I've seen so far has been I've been to Japan once. Jesus Christ, I can't find a singular true answer to this question. I lived in Japan as an exchange student and was lucky enough to visit Hiroshima with my host family, including my host grandmother who was a teenager during the war and remembered the events. I was privileged to get to have a frank and serious, but respectful, discussion with them when we visited. I still remember the way she described it, a terrible necessity. She felt that she would not have personally survived an invasion and described to me being trained as a teenage girl to fight Americans with sharpened bamboo spears and told that if she even killed one American before dying, she would have fulfilled her duty. They also felt that Japan would have been destroyed in an invasion and likely subdivided into Russian and American zones, a communist North Japan and a capitalist South Japan like you saw in Korea and Germany, and present-day Japan would be very different for the worse. When I visited Hiroshima with my family, my dad made some sort of comment about how the bombing was necessary to end the war. Our tour guide, who was obviously Japanese, very firmly said maybe so, but it was not necessary to drop it on the civilian population. They could have dropped it in the mountains to demonstrate its power. I think many native Japanese people share that opinion as well. I'm from Japan. So well I am of the belief that it was a necessary evil. Should the bombings never have occurred, there would have been an invasion, which would have been a bloodbath. America seriously underestimated the IA and IOF, Air Force, who had correctly guessed American landed zones and had fortified them. Even with this underestimating, the Americans predicted 1 million American losses. With Japanese mobilizing tens of millions of civilians and America having a force of 6 million, 1 million of whom are British. The invasion would get bloody. With millions dead on both sides. We're talking like 3.5 million dead and perhaps millions more wounded for the Americans. And tens of millions for the Japanese side. Along with occupation and even worse devastation. Yeah, this is pretty much what we're taught in American schools, that it was a necessary evil. I'm just glad that despite the war, Japan and America are now very close allies. I'm from Japan and subsequently moved to the United States. When I was living in Japan, we learned that a lot of people died and it was very sad. To read a lot of popular media, anime, books, shows, that attempt to illustrate the horrors of the bombings. There were some educators who would always say that it was unfair that UK and USA were allowed to colonize and commit atrocities, African slavery, murdering indigenous Americans, but when Japan attempted to expand, they were told it was inhumane. Once I moved to America, I was conflicted because it seemed to me that if it wasn't for the bombings, the war would have kept going for a while and we would have lost even more Japanese lives. At the end of the day, the Japan we know of today was created due to the pain and suffering from yesterday. So for me, I would say that the bombings lead us to where we are today, and I'm okay with that. Therese, no denying it's sad when civilian lives were lost though. The other thing that I often consider is that if the US had had to resort to a ground invasion, it likely would have also had a Soviet invasion from the north. Japan might have been like Korea to this day, divided into an autocratic police state in the north and a democracy in the south. Communist Hokkaido is actually a scary thought. It contains like a quarter of all Japan's arable land. I think it's important that native Japanese people of Reddit answer the question, but that's just my opinion. My mum is from Hiroshima, with her sister and parents still living there now. She has very differing views on the bombings than her family. My mum has the view that it was a necessary evil, due to the fact that it was a quick way of ending the war to prevent further bloodshed. Additionally, the knowledge of atrocities committed by the Japanese military greatly changed her view of the bombings. Whereas the rest of her family have the view that Japan was the victim and America was overstepping. I think this is because of the Japanese system, where very little of the atrocities are talked about. And it's mostly just about how Japan was a victim. My own personal view of the bombings are that it was required to end the war quickly. Coupled with the atrocities committed by the Japanese during the war, it was justified that the Allies dropped the bombs. I apologize for my bad grammar. This is as a result of being dyslexic. Apologizes for grammar, writes perfect English, you're good bro. My mother was born in Okinawa and was about 11 when the bombings happened. She had been pressed into service as a soldier, armed with a stick. When I asked her how she felt about it, she was wholeheartedly in support, despite the massive death and destruction, because she was pretty certain the Japanese emperor would have continued the fight until everyone was dead. She had been pressed into service as a soldier, armed with a stick with a what? Apparently women and children were trained to fight with bamboo sticks, another comment said. Native Okinawan here. Okinawa is where the Japanese soldiers decided to fight for the last battle of World War II. If it wasn't for the bombs, I feel as thought the Japanese would have never surrendered and would have been completely massacred on the final battle of Okinawa, along with even more Okinawan natives. The Japanese soldiers occupied our land and drove the native Okinawans to the mountains, scavenging resources from civilians and killing us if we didn't give up our hiding spots. My great-grandfather was stabbed in the stomach for not giving up his hiding cave but luckily survived. It's all terrible, but I can only imagine if those bombs weren't dropped, then what would have become of my people and the Japanese soldiers who were literally jumping off cliffs disemboweling themselves, blowing themselves up, because they were told not to be captured as prisoners. I wish the Japanese had surrendered sooner, but they had too much pride. Fun fact, if you have played the original COD World at War, the final stage is on Okinawa. Edit, removed sarcastic remark about the video game.